Since we are being webcast and people around the other side of the world are watching, permit me to say just a bit about the Wilson Center. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars is the nation's official memorial to our country's 28th president. We were created by an act of Congress in the 1960s, and we strive to serve as a bridge between the world of the policymaker and that of the academic. In other words, to commemorate both the scholarly depth and the public policy concerns of President Wilson, who was, as I'm sure you know, a distinguished academic long before he entered the rough and tumble of politics. This is an event today which gives us special pleasure because we welcome back to the Wilson Center one of our own, Ray Vickery, who spent some time with us here a couple years ago and worked on this book. Ray at times thought that the gestation period for this book was far, far longer than even what elephants go through. But Ray, it's here. And I commend it to all of you. I see that a number of you have already picked up copies, and the bookseller will be out at the conclusion of Ray's comments. If you haven't already gotten a copy, I urge you to get a copy. I would remind you that Father's Day is right around the corner, and this will make an excellent Father's Day gift. And indeed, you can even get the author to inscribe it if you purchase a copy today. It's actually a good time to be holding this event and talking about this topic, the strategic aspects of U.S. India economic engagement. Because it seems to me there's a fair amount of angst in both India and the United States about this bilateral partnership. Congressional Quarterly just over the weekend, in its most recent issue, published an article, and the subtitle is U.S. ties to Pakistan may be on the rocks, but relations with Pakistan's arch-rival India aren't doing all that much better. And Ray, I think that we will look to you to tell us to what extent that is correct and to what extent that's hyperbole. Ray was a Wilson Center public policy scholar here in 2008, 2009, as I already mentioned. So it is with a great deal of pleasure that we welcome him back today. We also want to welcome his wife Ann and his mother, whom I got to know during Ray's time here, and delighted to see them here as well. You probably know a great deal about Ray, so I'm just going to mention a couple of the highlights of a multifaceted and distinguished career. He is currently Senior Director at Albright Stonebridge Group, as well as of counsel at Hogan Lovells. He served as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Trade in the first Bill Clinton administration. One of his responsibilities in that position was to be in charge of India under the Big Emerging Markets Initiative. Many of us remember that initiative and the excitement that it generated. Earlier, Ray ran for and won public office, served 3 terms in the State Assembly in Virginia. His experience and connections to India extend back more than 4 decades. He was a Fulbright scholar in India in the 1960s, did his undergraduate work at Duke, and has a law degree from Harvard. Ray, we're delighted to have you back, and we turn things over to you now.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Bob. I very much appreciate that very kind introduction, and I want to say to you personally how much I appreciate all you've done and the people at the Asia program of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Michael Kugelman, Sue Levenstein, Bryce Wakefield, Joshua Spooner have all been very supportive throughout this process. Bob talks about the Woodrow Wilson Center as being unique, and it is, as a monument not only to President Wilson, but as a living memorial in which there is interaction on scholarly as well as political matters. Lee Hamilton, we all owe a lot, national treasure, was here and has provided one of the endorsements, and I'm very grateful to Lee. As you know, Jane Harmon, Congresswoman, has taken over and is leading that same great tradition. Michael Van Dusen, of course, has been instrumental throughout it. And I must say thanks, of course, to my publishers. That's the first obligation. Joe Brindley is here from the Woodrow Wilson Press. Emily Kahn was my editor here. And at Johns Hopkins University, Kathy Alexander is doing a lot for putting the book into public circulation. As Bob has said, the gestation period for this seems very, very long. We started this in 2008. I thought it was finished, and then we had this process that I didn't know about getting readers, and I'm very grateful particularly to Walter Anderson at Johns Hopkins University for his comments. And I made the mistake of saying to one of Ann's partners at Hogan Lovells the other day, a woman partner, that it's like having been pregnant for 3 years, and she fixed me with a stare and said, "You know nothing about what it's like to be pregnant." And I don't, but here's my mom, and you don't ever mention a lady's age, but I want you to know that my mom celebrated her 93rd birthday last Sunday. She's just finished her 55th year of running Parkwood School with 175 students, 24 teachers, and she is now taking reservations for next year. So I don't think anybody could be more grateful. And my brother Steve is here as well. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have served in the Clinton administration, to see Rick Enderforth, who was Assistant Secretary for South Asia and is now over at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We work together. There's a lot that's personal in this book from that experience, and experience that we've had both at Albright Stonebridge, at Hogan Lovells, and particularly with the U.S. India Business Council, and I'm very grateful to that. Now, when I first presented acknowledgments to Joe Brindley, he said, "Ray, you've got to be kidding. This is longer than the book is going to be." So I'm going to stop that and talk about the book for a little bit. And then I hope we can have a discussion, because there's so many experts here in the room. I see my friend Ambassador Ashley Wills, people from the State Department that we've known, other professors, Stanley Nolan, who know perhaps more than I do about the subject matter. But I just want to start out by saying I've just finished a book by Montaigne, the 16th century writer and essayist, and he gives various answers about how to live. And one of his answers is read a lot, but forget most of what you read. And I'm sure that those of you who do read the book won't remember everything. But I do want you to remember one thing, and that is that economic engagement is the engine of strategic cooperation. It's not, as some have said, the ballast for the ship of state that keeps it on course, and it's not the foundation which supports It is an active and important part of every strategic question. And unless you can take it into account, you are going to do less than justice to the issue at hand. Here in Washington, the myth is that politics drives economics, that it's all what happens at Capitol Hill or it's what happens in the executive branch, and that economics kind of comes along in the train of that. We'll discuss this a little bit further in a few minutes, but my view and the thesis of this work is that economic engagement most often drives strategic cooperation and not vice versa. I was interested to see in the Washington Post yesterday a front page article when Stop the Presses, somebody said, well, budget matters, we're going to come into the considerations about what we were going to do in Afghanistan. I would have thought that that would have been something that people would have recognized from the very first, and that the whole question of economic engagement was a driver in terms of being able to solve that problem as well as others. Now, what we have done with this book, I once used the term we when speaking myself when I was in the General Assembly of Virginia, and an old senator fixed me and said, Mr. Vickery, is that the royal we we're talking about? Well, I won't say that anymore. What we do in this book is try to look at case studies in the U.S. India relationship and to draw answers to certain fundamental questions about the conduct of foreign policy, the conduct of relations between nations, and the addressing of strategic issues. The book opens with 3 vignettes which are taken from these case studies. The first and the opening lines of the book are, during the night of November 26 through 27, 2008, terrorists moved methodically through the Taj Mahal and Oberoi hotels in Mumbai. Spreading mayhem, they looked especially for Americans and Britons to murder. The terrorists attacking Mumbai picked these luxury hotels as prime targets for a compelling strategic reason. And I submit to you that that compelling strategic reason was to smear and besmirch the success which India had had, largely in engagement with the United States, in building up a solid record of building prosperity and closer relations on addressing strategic problems through economic engagement. The second vignette is taken from an action on July 18, 2005, when President George W. Bush and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh entered a news conference at the White House East Room to endorse a joint statement they just issued. The pronouncement that caught the world's eye and captured the attention of strategic thinkers in both the U.S. and India concerned the possibility of civil nuclear cooperation. And from that has flowed, after some 3 years of very hard work by a number of people in this room, and I had the privilege of working on this, an initiative which has added so much. I see Dr. Saswal shaking his head here. He's one of the ones who's worked so hard on that. Has made all the difference in strategic terms. John Schlosser as well worked very hard on that same issue. The third vignette, taken from the case studies, though, is a cautionary tale and is a case study which shows that this is not a one-way street that's always going to help. In fact, economic engagement, when the consequences are disastrous, can have a very negative effect. And that case study begins in 1993. When a subsidiary of Enron signed an agreement to build in Dabhol, India, one of the world's largest gas-fired electrical power plants. This was to be the first of 8 so-called fast-track projects. In 2001, Enron and the Dabhol power project collapsed amidst allegations of fraud, corruption, and price gouging. Economic engagement between the United States and India on power development ground to a halt, and it has never recovered from that as we speak today. Now, it wasn't just in terms of power and addressing the question of how you provide electricity, which of course is absolutely necessary to economic development. It was all the work which we'd started on climate change. Charles Ludoff and I worked on that at the Commerce Department, and we tried to integrate that. I'll come back to these case studies in a minute. But I wanted to give you a flavor of what we're trying to do in addressing three basic questions. One, what is the impact of economic engagement on strategic relationship? The second question, what should be the impact of economic engagement on strategic relations? And the third question is, what, if anything, should the United States government do to make the impact of economic engagement work more fully to the benefit of the U.S. national interest? And I might say that I think the answer to the third question has as much application in India and in other countries as it does to the United States. And we'll come back and take a look at that. But let's take a little bit further look at the case studies which are in the book. The first one, I think, has to be the civil nuclear initiative and what happened in regard to civil nuclear cooperation. And to understand that, you have to go back to the roots of the relationship between the United States. And in the book, we have some historical recitation. George Perkovich, of course, has written on this subject very widely. But if you look at it in terms of a question of a strategic view of India and what India thought of itself as potentially a great nation, and then you see that when they actually tried to move forward to join an inner circle in 1974, the reaction of the United States in providing sanctions for the Tarapur fuel and the bad feelings that were engendered. And my experience, and this goes from my experience in the Big Emerging Markets Initiative, when we tried to re-engage in '94, this was a constant, even though unspoken, difficulty and barrier in the relationship. There was always the further question, no matter what you said about what you were going to do, as we prepared for Ron Brown's initial trip over there in 1995 to promote business and economic development. The underlying question was, yeah, but can you guys be trusted? That was from the Indian side. After all, when we tried to show that we were as good as you were, you pulled back on a deal we'd made. And on the U.S. side, it was, well, you know, you really can't trust those Indians because look what they did when the push came to shove in regard to nuclear matters. Now, we got over that, and then there were the tests in '98, and we were back in the same soup, and we had the same kinds of problems and the same kinds of difficulties. And you'll remember Strobe Talbot being sent out to negotiate with the Indians on guideposts which really were non-starters. And we, working with the business community at that time, realized that this could not be the way in which the strategic relationship would go forward. You couldn't be sanctioning your friends and your potential allies if you wanted to develop that kind of relationship. And so up in the Congress, we worked very hard with business to get those kinds of sanctions cut back. And then, of course, there was a realization in 2000 by my good friend Sandy Berger and the president that we had to take a different tack in regard to India. And so we had a trip in 2000 in which I worked with the U.S. India Business Council to do the business part of it. And we put a whole different dimension on it, and it was no longer sanctions. And of course, the world changed in 2001. And then we saw, as I think was very proper, that we had to address this question about the civil nuclear status, the nuclear status of India. And we started off with a high-tech cooperation group. We didn't start from the top down at the United States in trying to change that policy. It was by looking at the economic engagement in regard to high-tech and dual use that we started. And then that led to the next steps in strategic partnership, where we started to address what was called the trinity of issues in regard to civil nuclear space and dual-use issues. And then finally, the vignette which I open with, July 18th, 2005, the George W. Bush administration seized the initiative. And of course, that was just the start, really, and the next 3 years showed the very fundamental role which economic engagement played in being able to move that strategic ball forward. For were it not for a coalition for partnership within India that Ranveer Trehan and others in this room worked on so hard, to pull together business and the force of economic engagement together with that of Indian Americans and people in the policy community, that initiative would have never happened. And what would have been the result of that? The result would be that we would still be in a posture with India of each side having the old recriminations just beneath the surface. Since that time, we've been able to go forward, not only in defense purchases, although there has been a setback lately, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, later in the afternoon. But we've been able to do a lot on so many levels that we weren't able to do, and this book outlines that in terms of the first case study. The second case study has to do with outsourcing. I must say at this point that it's obvious that the way in which I have defined strategic for this purpose, for the purposes of this book, is to use it in its broadest sense, to denote the ability to cooperate across national boundaries on the fundamental issues which affect the two countries and require transnational, international activity in order to be able to solve them. And I think that's proper. Laura Tyson and many others have recognized that the line between economic, national security, defense security, military security, those lines are gone. It may have been possible at earlier times to try to separate those out, but in today's world where things go at the speed of light around the world, that is no longer possible. And you have to look at food security, as India constantly talks about it. You look at health security, and one of the ways in which security is promoted is by being able to address economic development. Now, in regard to outsourcing, there's good news and bad news in terms of it. It is not a question of yes, it all goes forward in a positive upward path. Kent Hughes, to whom I owe a debt of thanks here at the Woodrow Wilson Center as well, has written very broadly on competitiveness. the President Ronald Reagan's Competitiveness Council defined competitiveness as the degree to which a nation can, under free and fair market conditions, produce goods and services that meet the test of international markets while simultaneously maintaining or expanding the real income of its citizens. The difficulty, of course, is that there is a tension here. And there are those, particularly on the left, who say, well, expanding the real income of its citizens is hurt by the process of outsourcing, whereas people on with another perspective would say, yes, but you have to be able to have worldwide sourcing to make your companies competitive and build your own economy if you are going to reach the goal of cooperation on economic development. So this chapter takes a look at these forces and shows how it has been both helpful and hurtful in terms of the U.S. India strategic relationship. There's a chapter on economic engagement and preserving the peace, the reaction to terrorism. As you may have seen, Tom Friedman has written about this in a couple of places. And what I've done is take what happened on December the 13th, 2001. Many people in the United States forget that it's not just us in 2001 that had a terrorist attack, but there was an attack on the Indian Parliament which sought to do nothing less than completely decapitate the entire elected leadership of India by killing them all at the Parliament. And we came very close to war in 2002, but it didn't happen. And one of the factors I think that's shown in this chapter is that economic engagement of India served as an ameliorating factor which caused people to take a longer view than they might otherwise have taken and resulted in the ability of the United States and India to bring their cooperation to a further level. And this experience was essentially repeated in regard to the 26/11 attacks in Mumbai. We've talked about electric power and the environment and double. That was in one of the opening vignettes. I was the chair of an interagency working group on environmental exports. This was under the Trade Promotion Coordinating Committee, and I see with the nomination of Mr. Bryson in terms of being Secretary of Commerce that this is a foremost part of his portfolio. And what we did was try to work both the climate change agenda and the energy agendas together. But when Dobble collapsed, and it wasn't just Dobble, there were seven other cases that have just happened. Sandy, come in and have a seat. We've already thanked you, but we'll thank you again while you're here. We appreciate you coming. This was a setback across the board on these strategic issues. There's a chapter on the Iran pipeline. When Swadesh Chatterjee and I went up to see Chairman Tom Lantos in the fall of 2007, we were trying to check as to whether or not the civil nuclear deal could go forward. And he came in, and we came in, he sat down, and the chairman looked at us. He had a little white dog next to him on the chair and said, "Yes, gentlemen, what can I do for you?" And I knew we were in for a rough ride. And he said, in words of substance, "I love India. I love the Indian people. I understand the historic perspective. I understand the need for power. I understand the independence of India and making its own decisions. But let me tell you, if the Indians go forward with the Iran pipeline, I'm going to kill this measure. It's not going anywhere. Well, I think this chapter deals with that perspective, and it perhaps does not deal with it in the way the chairman would have liked, God rest his soul. What I think it does show is that taking a broader perspective in terms of what the economic needs are on both sides. There are profiles here of the U.S. energy situation as well as India, and showing the similarities and showing how that economic factors in terms of price, in terms of alternatives, can have a greater impact than a negative use of economic engagement, which is the way it's usually thought of. And that is, well, we'll put sanctions on it, and that will be able to solve something. Too often, the Congress looks at those because it's cheap. It's an easy thing to do, as opposed to really taking a more substantive approach. And so this chapter explores that. We look at the meltdown and what happened in 2007, 8, 9, and right on up to the first time, and multilateralism, and how economic factors have been very important, not only in what happens with the WTO and the other multilateral agencies that you generally think of, but what has happened in meeting the meltdown and broadening the approach to a G20 from a G7 or G8 in terms of those very important strategic issues. A chapter which is very close to my heart is that on the green revolutions. And it's very close to my heart because my dad worked on the first green revolution when he was an officer at the Foreign Agricultural Service. And in fact, I was there in India in 64 and 65 when the green revolution really went. And what most people don't appreciate is the relationship between PL 480 and that program of assistance and what happened in regard to Norman Borlaug and the ability to inject American technology into the question of what is today called food security. And what we do going from there is to look at the calls for a second green revolution. As Norman Borlaug predicted, we are now on the part of the curve where we're once again faced with the question of how you feed people and how you're able to do it. And people say, well, we'll have another green revolution, a second green revolution. Well, the reality is that you can't take those same template that worked in the 60s in terms of U.S. aid and the injection of technology on essentially a government and an NGO basis and expect it to work. People are flabbergasted that it hasn't. The problem is much more systemic, and it takes a holistic approach to be able to do it. India has to do its part. There have to be reforms in terms of caps on retail sale of food. You're not going to be able to get a value chain which enables agriculture to go forward simply by having an injection from the top of technology. And so that's what this chapter does. The final case study has to do with health security. And takes as its example what has happened between the United States and India and HIV/AIDS. But the whole approach is much broader than that, because in order to be able to attack that problem, you have to be able to attack the problem of what happens in the international pharmaceutical area. And so we look at how India got into the WTO by approving the TRIPS agreement, trade-related intellectual protection, and show that it was actually economic engagement by a few companies in India that had aspirations of world-class status that enabled the engagement to take place, which then brought India into a position where it could accept TRIPS and eventually amend its legislation. And then we look at how other organizations, how the Clinton Foundation, the Gates Foundation, how U.S. aid all entered into this picture to take a situation in which, because of the gap in terms of intellectual property, there was not any cooperation to speak of, to build a situation where now the two countries are working very closely together in terms of fighting this scourge. So those are the case studies that are here. We have, we think in the end, some perspectives on the three questions that we've indicated earlier. The first of them in terms of what is the impact. My good friend Tom Campbell here, who's an agricultural expert, said, Ray, if you want me to read this book, you better make it short and have a lot of pictures. Now I don't have a lot of pictures, Tom, but I do have one, and I just want to show you this little chart here. This is a chart of what I refer to as feedback loops. And what it shows is that and you can't see the bottom of this chart. I'll just do this over here.
Change it to 100%, then we'll see if it opens.
Well, Joe, you know how to do that, but I'm not exactly as proficient as you are. And what this is intended to show is that what I'm talking about in terms of what is the impact is really operates in loops between economic engagement, the U.S. electorate, between economic engagement, U.S. officials, and the officials and the electorate. And you must look at the question of what the impact is of economic engagement, not in terms of a straight linear approach, but in terms of a loop. And the question is, where do you have inflection points that can change what is the mindset and the ability to cooperate? And I submit that the impact is that having economic engagement as the inflection point is more often going to work in terms of bringing countries together to address strategic issues than taking the point of view of the linear, we politicians will decide this, the Congress will pass a law, the President will say this, the Army will go out, the Navy, the Marines, and that will produce the strategic results we want. It's not that that isn't important. Those things are all important. They are individually important, but they are not all important in the sense that they are the whole picture. And this is where we're trying to go with the answer to the question of what is the impact. Now there is a question of what should be the impact, and you might say, most people might say, well, it is what it is. You said it's important. I mean, what do you mean what should be the impact? When I was at the Department of Commerce, I was astounded after Sandy and the President and some others had, with the urging of Ron Brown and the studies we'd done at the Department of Commerce, changed the approach in regard to China in regard to trade. And when we first started off, you know, there was this idea that we weren't going to extend certain statuses in trade unless China would do certain things. And after a lot of discussion, that was changed, and I thought that was a good thing, because then we made it seemed to me made some more progress on it. But I can remember Jim Hoagland writing an op-ed piece in which he said, this is in essence selling the national heritage for a mess of pottage, and you can't do that. So some people, in answer to this question of what should be the impact, say there shouldn't be. You should try to minimize that. The Economist, at the same time, I remember had a cover, and the picture was of a hand with money in it. That this was akin to bribery in terms of what you're doing. It's not bribery. It's a question of finding mutual self-interest. So you promote the proverbial win-win situation, which then enables people to cooperate more. So rather than backing off, you ought to use it more positively. I can also remember when I first went to the Commerce Department to set up the Advocacy Center, that some people who were working there and had been through 12 years of the other party in control said, well, we can't really get involved in that because that'll be an interference with the market. We can't do anything in trying to utilize economic engagement for strategic purposes by promoting U.S. Companies, because that will interfere with the market. I think we have seen that argument does not carry the day, and the bottom line for this book is that yes, it should be, and it should be used positively. You ought to try to get away from looking at economic engagement in a strategic sense just in terms of sanctions. And you ought to look across the whole range, not only trade in goods and services and investment, foreign direct investment, portfolio investment, aid, but monetary policy and what happens in terms of the regulatory framework in which these things are conducted. That doesn't mean that the strategic goal then circumvents and takes over the whole picture, but it means that it's fundamental to the solution of any of the issues. Now, finally, the question of what, if anything, the U.S. government should do to use economic engagement more effectively in the national interest. And in this book, I make 4 suggestions, and I think that they are probably obvious to anybody who's been in government. But I believe that they are of saliency and importance across the board. And the first is that economic engagement should be an integral part of planning to further U.S. interest on every strategic issue and international relationship of importance to the United States. I said this to my wife, and she said, well, we're always doing that. They were doing that back when I was involved in the Nixon administration. I knew that wasn't a good tack to take. And what I'm talking about is that too often there is an economic box over here, and then there's the strategic box over here, which means defense. And then at some point along the line, somebody says, well, yeah, of course, economics is a part of that. And it's put together, and there's the policy. We got our economic and we got our strategic, but it's there. That's not good enough in terms of the way the United States government ought to be operating. It ought to be a ground-up planning process to recognize the strategic strand in regard to addressing, to recognize the economic strand in addressing each of these strategic issues. The second proposition is to go with that. You're going to have adequate professional expertise that you do not have in the United States government at this point. There is still a bias, particularly in regard to international strategic matters, toward the broad liberal arts, the traditional English approach that you had a gentleman who was schooled in the arts and traditions, and they could handle any problem that came up. And I can tell you, and here earlier I said I think that some of these apply to India, perhaps even more than to the United States. It's the same problem in regard to India. The Indian Administrative Service is by and large like the U.S. Foreign Service, peopled with those who don't have economic expertise. They don't have business experience. And I'm not saying it supplements, it takes over and supplants altogether, but I'm saying if you're going to have a planning process that works and bring this into, you're going to have the people and the professional expertise to be able to do that. Now, since economic business since economic and business expertise is limited and unevenly distributed throughout the government, it follows that you have to have an interagency process which will draw on each of the relevant agencies who have expertise. That means that when you're considering a strategic matter which has agricultural impact, you have to have the Department of Agriculture involved in that. If it's energy, it has to be energy. If it's in regard to overall trade, commerce, the Trade Promotion Coordinating Committee was, in my opinion, during the Clinton administration, the single best example of interagency coordination for that type of interagency activity. And what I'm suggesting is that there must be ways to cut down the bureaucratic infighting, the one department against the other, to be able to draw from this expertise wherever it goes. Now, Sandy and others put together a staff which was both National Security Council and NEC, which is a huge step forward to be able to do that, to be able to, at the top, to be able to have that integration. But that process has actually, in my view, backslidden since the time of the Clinton administration, and it needs to be furthered rather than forgotten. Finally, the private sector should be an integral part of using economic engagement to further U.S. strategic issues. There is no question that the approach of public-private partnerships is the way to go. In a time when our government does not have the wherewithal even for what I would consider very basic kinds of services, it is going to be impossible to muster what needs to be done in terms of economic engagement without strong public-private partnerships. And there are those who run from that perspective and say, oh no, there's too much involved, it'll be just corruption, people be feathering their own nest. There are people who say that it just is not an appropriate way, and there are very, very great problems. But in terms of what has been put together for advocacy outlines and standards for approaches that can be able to do that, there is a lot of work to be done. This is a crucial time for the United States. I think that, the old analogy that it takes 100 years to grow an oak tree, but in one afternoon you can get out there with a chainsaw and cut it down, is very much applicable to what we see ourselves doing in strategic matters today. Instead of drawing back from what we need to do internationally, we need to take a better and smarter look at the role of economic engagement. It is a force multiplier. It is a way forward that can bring together the countries like India and the United States into strategic relationships which build peace and prosperity, and that's the thesis of this book.
Well, thanks, Ray. I have talked with Ray about this book. I have read the book. I've even dared edit some of the chapters. And yet I enjoyed this presentation just as much as the very first time I went on the topic with you. It's a terrific book. I do commend it to you. It's accessible to even economic non-literates, illiterates like myself. It's interesting. It combines Ray's personal experiences into a broader storyline. As you know, it's organized on a series of case studies. Some of these cases I thought I knew a fair amount about, and I was just astonished by how much I learned, and moreover, the learning was enjoyable. So for these and other reasons, I certainly commend it to you. I want to open it to members of the audience now. But Ray, I'm going to ask you the first question. I'm going to pick up on really your very last point, and that is about the private sector. Can you, by giving us a couple of specifics, illustrate how you would mobilize the strengths of the private sector in furtherance of national goals, the national agenda? What would you do that is not being done or not being done well at this point?
I think that the Obama administration has made a lot of progress in this area, and with the announcement of the nomination for Secretary of Commerce, intends to make more. It was not helpful, in my opinion, to start off with an idea that the business community was to be held at abeyance and was not an appropriate player in economic and strategic matters. I do think that Mr. Immelt being involved was a good move, but I do not see at this point an acceptance across the board in terms of public-private partnerships as the dynamic factor that it should be in terms of promoting the national strategic issues, the national strategic interest. I'm a strong believer in advocacy. And I think that we can do a better job in terms of building public-private partnerships in terms of advocacy for American engagement, which is going to make a substantial impact both strategically and in terms of building prosperity here in the United States. And it's not that any one official hasn't advocated, and there has been advocacy. The problem, in my view, is that we do not have, at this point, the kind of interaction that we should have in identifying those areas, deals, opportunities for that to happen. I think that there's been a great step forward in terms of the President's export initiative. But what needs to be done, it seems to me, is not only view that initiative in terms of whether it builds jobs in the United States, but what it does in terms of the relations with the countries in which we're engaged in trying to export to. It's a two-way street in all instances, And it seems to me that we can do a better job in reinvigorating the advisory structure that we have had for both Commerce, USTR, State Department, and integrating those so that we have a concerted effort, and we put to rest completely the approach and attitude that somehow that's not a legitimate thing to do, that's not something that should be done. Now, having said that, it is true that we have to be able to answer those questions not only about not having people use it for just self-interest, but what happens in regard to a market. We can't just say, hey, you got to buy American because it's American. But there has to be, and this is the reason that the whole question of planning, I don't think government works by one person, or no matter how bright, how wonderful they are, that says, yes, this is the way it is. And I think you recognize this, everybody in this room who's been, there has to be the kind of support mechanism that presents to the people who then are doing the advocacy, who are involved in promoting that kind of economic engagement, the wherewithal, the resources, the cases upon which that can be done and make a difference. And I'm not satisfied that happens. I'm not satisfied that at the State Department there is significant integration between the econ side of the House and the political military side of the House in terms of what we're going to be able to do with the private sector. And that's true not just in regard to India, that's true in regard to Afghanistan, that's true across the board in my humble opinion. But so it's not as specific perhaps, Bob, as you'd like. And I'd like to make it more specific. Maybe we'll do another book on that.
Is that a promise? All right, let's open it up to you. If you'll raise your hand, I'll call on you. Joshua will bring you the microphone, and if you'll introduce yourself here in the middle. And you'll have to excuse me. We have a new row of lights up here, and they're right in my eyes, so some of you I probably know, but I can't see you.
Okay, well, my name is Charles Ludoff, and I'm best seen in light like that, where I can see you, but you can't see me.
I could have told you he's a troublemaker.
So just picking up on Ray's point at the end, which opened up and relates to my question, the linkage between strategic and economic policy. Little weak maybe at the State Department, a little bit since the TPCC has fallen away. Maybe a little weaker. My question is India and the United States equally ready to deal with explicit linkages between strategic goals and economic achievements in cooperation?
Well, I think it's a very good question, Charles. And I guess you could say the medium multi-role combat aircraft situation really raises that question in very stark terms. And I guess the dust hasn't settled enough, and we don't know. I don't know there's ever been a debrief, for example, on what happened there. I think everybody in the room is.
Give us just a little bit.
Everybody's
of
familiar that the medium multi-role combat aircraft acquisition was seen by many, and I think this is true in India as well as the U.S., as a next step following on greater strategic partnership in civil nuclear and in other areas. The U.S. companies were eliminated from the competition even before the final round. They didn't even get to the final round. It was supposedly done on just a technical basis. The Air Force, Indian Air Force, said that they shouldn't get in, and there should be an airplane which has never been bought outside of the country of manufacturer. That's the Rafale in France. And the Eurofighter, which is evidently a great plane in many ways, but doesn't have the radar, which was considered so fundamental, even in place at this point. I mean, it's to be developed, and it may be better, and there may be incentives. So what happened was the U.S. companies were out, and I think, and maybe, I don't know if this is what you're alluding to, the idea was, well, there shouldn't be a strategic component to that. That was the Indian view, evidently. There shouldn't be a strategic component, and we ought to make this on a technical ground. So I do think that there's some question about that, and I do think that it's going to take a lot of sorting out, because the blame is not all on the Indian side. Certainly there's enough to go around on the U.S. side in terms of what the restrictions are and whether or not India is being treated for this purpose, and this is a type of economic engagement, although it impacts strategic very directly. Have we, in terms of our export controls and the whole sales apparatus, come to a point where it really works the way it should, with what I consider to be it should be the most important strategic relationship of the 21st century. I mean, if it's not going to be China that's your most, and there's obvious problems in there in terms of not being like India, a democracy with a rule of law, a multi-ethnic country such as we are. You're going to have to, it seems to me, be able to have on both sides a relationship which does give credence and stability to the strategic relationship. Now, as Rick Enderfurth has pointed out in a very well-considered Wall Street Journal op-ed, listen, there's a lot that's right. The glass is more than half full, in spite of what your article implied there. I think you'd have to say by any measure the relationship, the strategic relationship between the U.S. and India is at its high point. I mean, I don't think it's been better than this. The question is it good enough? And is it going to be able to do that? And I think that Charles' question is a very good one. And I think it's time, and Ranjana at Vickery, you might want to do a seminar on this. Ranjana, as you know, is the Ranjana Khanna, very eminent representative of one of the great trade associations of India. There needs to be a step back and a look at what this means in terms of both sides, because it seems to me that this is not just a question of, well, you pick something off the shelf. I mean, this is $11 billion to start with. And the figure really is going to be a lot more than that, but even more importantly, the whole question's about interoperability and so forth. Now, that having been said, it's true that you're not going to, India is never going to be, well, I say never, is not at this point in a position where you'd say it's a military ally, and there are strong democratic traditions in India, so they don't want to be that. But if the thesis which I have is that this is the most important strategic relationship ultimately in terms of the 21st century is going to go forward, and if my thesis is further right that the driver of that relationship is economic engagement, then it behooves both sides to be able to come together and continue the look at how we're going to be able to do this. The U.S. India relationship, there's been a lot of euphoria, and the Obama trip was great. I was there, and, I thought nobody could top what Bill Clinton did, and Sandy did, and then George W. Bush seemed to top that in a way with civil nuclear. Well, now nobody's going to top what those guys did. And President Obama had a blockbuster of a trip there. But this is not a relationship which can be on autopilot or is there and is accepted. There are so many areas that it has to be a daily look at the kinds of questions that Charles has raised if we're going to really make it go forward and make it what it ought to be for both the U.S. and India.
Here. We're getting the microphone to you.
I'll try to be shorter. I'm sorry.
It's a tough question, an important question.
My name is Jorge Jaime. I'm a former Chilean ambassador to India. I'm currently at the Latin American program of the Wilson Center. Mr. Vickery, I have a question for you. You emphasize the importance of economic engagement for strategic purposes and strategic considerations. And I'd like to press you a little bit on that. It seems to me there's this great paradox. On the one hand, everybody recognizes that what is happening in India is extremely important. People talk about the Indian miracle and so on, everything that's happened in the past 20 years. Yet on something as strategically important for the United States as Afghanistan, the Indian perspective and Indian interests in Afghanistan get permanently short shrift from the Washington perspective. And the Pakistani version of what India is up to in Afghanistan gets, a lot of preference. Why is that? I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on that. That may not be the central topic of your book, but I would think you would have some perspectives on that.
Yeah, I think that, in analyzing these situations, in any particular situation, which with strategic implications, and I emphasize my definition of strategic is pretty broad, it's a lot easier to look at what meeting took place and what decision came out of that and what battalion was dispatched somewhere in terms of the analysis of what happens and why it happens. And what I'm suggesting is that let's just take the question of what India does in regard to what the U.S. does in Afghanistan, as opposed to what happens with Pakistan. I think that the message that I have is that economic engagement is a driver of the ability to cooperate on those kinds of issues. And I have no doubt that were it not for the kinds of economic engagements that have taken place between the U.S. and India during the focus period of this book, which is really the time from the time India started its liberalization process in 1991 to 2010, that the United States and India, in regard to what's going on in Afghanistan, would be so much further apart than they are today in terms of cooperation in regard to Afghanistan that you couldn't even consider us in the same league. I don't believe that simply looking at the traditional military defense kinds of relationship, the traditional animosity between Pakistan and India, that you would come out with an analysis and a way forward which would enable the U.S. and India to cooperate more closely in regard to Afghanistan. Now, as to the question of why it is that Pakistan seems to get more press here, I think that this is another indication of really the short-sightedness of the people who are commenting on it, who'd rather report on the immediate guns and bullets and who got shot today than they would in terms of what happens in a broader sense. That's not that, and this goes back to your feedback loops. Sure, what happens on the political side is going to go back to the economic, and it's not a one-way street. But I do think that in terms of what really is going on in regard to Afghanistan, you'd be very well advised to look very closely at the economic questions involved. And I think that goes from the perspectives of what happens with Central Asia and oil and gas, and I think it goes to the question of how people make a living in Afghanistan. I think it goes to the whole question of whether or not there are trade relationships between India and Pakistan and what that's contributing. So I don't think I have a really good answer for you as to why it is that what you see on the front pages of the American press emphasizes so much Pakistan. But I do think that each of these things that I have talked about, whether it be what happened in regard to December 13th, 2001, or the 26th to 27th of November 2008, the question of the impact of outsourcing on that has had an impact on the way in which the United States and India are approaching Pakistan. And I think that if we got our strategy right in terms of India, that force of economic engagement would bring us further, closer together in regard to Pakistan. I think that many of the things which India has seen in regard to the inadequacies of the way in which Pakistan's security operations have been involved, but that India's been saying, we are seeing that now. One of the reasons we see that is because we're friends and because this economic engagement has driven us to a place where we have strategic cooperation. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't be able to do it. So again, it's too long-winded a way of saying that I think that that if you look at the situation in depth, the economic questions will be very fundamental to what happens in the whole AFPAC-India conundrum.
Other questions? One here. Joshua, we're making you work.
I'm Albert Cantrell, and I'm in the. This on? Okay. Yeah, I'm Albert Cantrell in the field of opinion research, and in your model.
Speak loudly. I'm not sure it is working.
I'm Albert Cantrell in the field of opinion research, and I notice in your model here in your feedback loops the U.S. and the Indian electorates, which obviously gets to the general public in both countries. Could you expand on when and how the publics in these countries get involved, perhaps in terms of discussion of the case studies you have, but with a particular emphasis on the question of how you get general publics in these countries to see these issues as a win-win proposition rather than us-them?
Well, I think that one of the first things, and you know this from your studies, is that any opinion poll that's been taken in India shows that the U.S. is wildly popular in India compared even to the United States. If you look at the approval ratings of our presidents and so forth, when they're at home having so much problem that they are running 50, 60% approvals. So something's getting through about the relationship, which you don't necessarily get from reading the Hindu or the Times of India or any other great newspaper, where the tendency is to stress the left is opposing the civil nuclear. We don't want to have cooperation. We don't want to have foreigners in our higher education. I mean, that's the kind of thing that makes news. But as I say, these underlying, and you, this is your field, these underlying numbers indicate that it is having an impact in terms of what our interests are and cooperation. Now, one of the areas, one of the case studies has to do with outsourcing and H-1B visas. And, you know, you talk about the relationship between the electorate and what happens in Indian politics. And there's a great correlation. Whenever John Kerry stands up and says, we aren't going to put up with these Benedict Arnold companies who are taking our jobs away, that becomes a campaign issue in India. When President Obama says we're going to build jobs in Buffalo and not Bangalore, that has and it becomes an election issue. BJP said very specifically, in 2009 we'll make this an issue, and it was a campaign issue. Now they didn't win the election, so it didn't carry the day. But these feedbacks are very, very important in terms of how they're treated and what the officials do. And I'll look forward to talking with you because you probably know more about it than I do.
Yes.
Now, David really does know, you know, having worked with Tata all these years.
Yeah, my name is David Good, and I'm a colleague of Ray's now.
I'm not sure
Anyway,
it is,
never
but
mind,
go.
I'll speak loud. Ray, if I understood you correctly, what you're saying is that the economic relationship has really been the driver of this new transformed relationship, but that it hasn't really sort of moved into a strategic sense, that the strategic aspects haven't really been taken advantage of or haven't been exploited to their fullest. Now maybe you're sort of scrunching up your face, or maybe I'm wrong. But I think I also heard you say that one of the reasons has been sort of a lack of imagination or a lack of experience or a lack of training on the part of policymakers, both in the United States and in India. But my experience when I was at the State Department was that as far as India is concerned, to a great extent, there was always a battle, strategic battle between those people who said there was a strong case to be made for a strategic relationship and that it should be made, it should be exploited, and those people who said, no, there's no strategic relationship with India possible. You know, it's just fine to have an economic relationship and a trade relationship, but it's just not possible for a number of different reasons. I mean, a lot of these were the non-pro types who were arguing against a strategic relationship with India. In the course of your research, did you find that that's the case, or that it's still going on, or whether there's still an ascendancy of one one group over another?
Well, you know, you've had a long and distinguished career in the Foreign Service, David, and I think that you have seen some of the same things that I have, and your question adequately and accurately reflects the tension which is there. And I believe that tension is as you describe it. There are those who want to view the relationship based on what they would consider political and strategic issues, and say, fine, you can do things economically over here, but that doesn't really have anything to do with what we got to get, because we're the real diplomats, And we're the guys who know about guns and bombs and that sort of stuff. And the economics part of it, well, that's fine. And probably, particularly, and you tell me, when we started the focus of this, the focus period of 1991, in the early 90s, there were a lot more people who would have taken the position that, well, these things are really separate and we can't have a strategic relationship with them. I do think, and this is where I guess I was squinching my face up, that we have made great progress in these strategic areas. If you look at cooperation on terrorism, I think that there's a lot more that is done. I think that in terms of homeland security, there's you just look at the acquisition picture. Although they don't, India, as you know, doesn't release those numbers. I mean, it's obviously that there's a lot that's going on. So my thesis is that we have made progress, and I wouldn't take my comments on terms of what we ought to do better as indicating that we haven't, because as I've tried to say, I don't think that we would be in the posture that we're in now, which I think is very positive, unless we'd had this economic engagement take place over the past 2 decades.
Okay, got time for one more question. Back in the back.
I decided to give him a break walking. So. I have not yet read your book, but I very much look forward to it, and I'm very excited to read it.
Let me get you to introduce yourself.
Oh, hi. Doug Jackson. I'm with JWI. I was actually formerly a research assistant here last year, working for Dinshaw Mystery, actually. You mentioned President Obama's blockbuster trip to India, and I think it was during that trip that he commented on India's long-held dream of a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and his comments were very favorable. And I had a question about that and how you see it fitting into your model, because I think at that time and even now, U.S. companies have not yet received any deals to build any of the reactors that were negotiated in the civil nuclear deal. And I think it was after that that basically American companies were cut out of the running for the jet fighter deal. So is that an example possibly of strategic considerations trying to drive economic engagement, or do you interpret it otherwise in your model?
Well, it goes back to loops, you know. It's not a question of one being only one way, and I think there is a feedback in there in terms of what happens with a seat on the Security Council. That affects how people look at things economic, some issues economically, and I think it would be unrealistic to say that the question of whether or not India is ready and should be a member of the Security Council is unaffected by economic engagement considerations. And again, here is an area in which there are commentators who will say, well, it should be completely separated and those things have nothing to do with each other. But the reality, it seems to me, is that they do have something to do with each other. And I believe, and going back again, this goes back to what I was saying to David, that what has happened over the past 20 years, I think it is inconceivable that in 1991, given the estrangement between the two countries, that a president of the United States would have endorsed India for the Security Council. It wouldn't have done it. It just would have been inconceivable. Now, what happened to change that picture? And you can talk about, well, there was an interest vis-a-vis what happens in, I don't know, the Straits of Malacca. And so, therefore, that's a strategic interest. And that's what changed it. Or you could go and have a traditional kind of geopolitical analysis of it and say that. But in my view, and the thesis of this book is, those approaches really are a part of the story, but the driving force to get us from where we were in 1991 to where we are now, or where we were in November when the president endorsed India for the Security Council, is economic engagement. Now, there are a lot of other factors in there about values and so forth, but the sine qua non, it wouldn't have happened otherwise if we hadn't been able, if India hadn't opened up its economy, started buying some American goods, selling some things, if there hadn't been trade in services, if there hadn't been a lot of H-1B visas, if there hadn't been Indian students coming over here, that's an export of services after all, of higher education. If there hadn't been this kind of movement forward, the ability of President Obama, or the willingness of the United States of America, put it to another way, to endorse India for the Security Council would have never happened. And so it behooves us, in looking at where we're going to go with India, and it behooves India in where they're going to go with us, that we better take a very strong look at economic engagement as the driver of the relationship.
And on that note, I will ask you to join me in expressing our appreciation to Ray.